Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wild, and distinguished members of the House, my name is Paulo Figueiredo, and I am the living, breathing proof of human rights violations in Brazil. For doing the work of a good journalist, I am censored in all social media, I have my assets frozen, and my Brazilian passport canceled, all without due process. I come from a family with a long legacy of fighting tyranny. My great-grandfather, General Euclides Figueiredo, led a revolution against Brazil's most brutal dictator, Getúlio Vargas. For that, he spent years in a dungeon. His son, my grandfather, João Figueiredo, became Brazil's 30th president in 1979, tasked with ending the 15-year-long military regime. As president, he granted amnesty, held free elections, allowed multiple political parties, and by the end of his term, peacefully handed power back to civilians, restoring full democracy in Brazil. I never imagined this legacy of fighting for individual freedoms would span generations and fall upon me as well. Until the end of 2022, year of Brazil's latest presidential election, I was a political commentator on JP News, a TV network often compared to US Fox News. The primetime show I was in had been voted the best in the country and had more viewers than the next two networks combined, including the local CNN. I had over 5 million followers across all social media with higher engagement than virtually any other journalist in Brazil. By any account, I was one of the most influential journalists in the country, until I started being targeted by a series of decisions from the highest court in the land. In December 2022, I had all my social media accounts blocked for Brazilians. Later, I learned that the order would extend to freezing my financial assets, suspending the confidentiality of my financial transactions, threatening exorbitant fines every time I said something that displeased Justice Alexandre de Moraes, and even canceling my Brazilian passport. I disappeared from my entire audience. This is the modern equivalent of being sent to a dungeon, as was my great-grandfather. In January 2024, following Lula's inauguration and the January 8th riots, Brazil's Department of Justice opened a case against JP News, accusing the channel of fomenting the revolt. Demonetized by YouTube, faced with new criminal case and threat of losing its public concession, JP News gave in and laid off all its conservative commentators and adopted a more Moraes-friendly editorial stance. I was unemployed with all my assets frozen and my work tools blocked. Rumble and locals promised to always stand for freedom of expression, so I joined, quickly becoming one of the biggest content creators on both, with 120,000 subscribers on Rumble and nearly 60,000 subscribers and 2,000 paid subscribers on locals. However, in December 2023, pressured by absurd orders issued by Moraes, with me being one of the main targets, I believe, both platforms closed access to all Brazilians. The financial loss has been unbearable. On February 8, 2024, Brazilian newspapers reported a new offensive against me. I was apparently being investigated for accurately reporting on primetime TV the behind-the-scenes meetings of the Brazilian Army's High Command in December 2022. In this investigation, a new measure was issued prohibiting me from having contact with former President Bolsonaro and any other person investigated, a clear intimidation tactic that hinders my journalist activities. There's one single name behind every one of these decisions. That's Alexandre de Moraes. Remember this name. He's the de facto dictator of Brazil. He's a Supreme Court justice, the head of the Superior Electoral Court, known as TSC, and the man in charge of the infamous fake news probe, which began in 2019 and is still open. An alarming caveat. Through all this, my work was being carried out from my studio in Florida, where I have been residing since 2016. I have therefore been under the jurisdiction of this country the entire time, and consequently protected by the rights guaranteed in the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America. American companies have been obeying legal orders directly from Brazilian judges without following international procedures and sharing data of individuals under American jurisdiction. This Congress should address this issue, as it is not only violates our constitutional rights, but also exposes an intelligence risk and potentially violates the FCPA. By no means I was the only journalist affected. On the same day, award-winning journalists and bestseller authors Rodrigo Constantino, present here in this hearing, and Guilherme Fiuza were targets of nearly identical copy and paste decisions. Other journalists, such as Alan dos Santos, also present here today, had faced even harsher measures, including arrest orders. Libertarian podcaster Monarch, known as the Brazilian Joe Rogan, suffered a similar fate. They're both exiled in the US. There are numbers of other examples, including comedians or even a judge, Ludmila Grillo, here in the audience, or congressmen like Nicolas Ferreira and Gustavo Gayer, also present here, Marcel Van Hatten, Carlos Jordi, Alexandre Ramagem, Carla Zambelli, many other members of Congress, and even Senator Marcos Duval, who had their social media blocked, offices raided, or passports taken by Moraes. Congressman Daniel Silveira is currently serving 9 years in prison for recording a video harshly criticizing Moraes. Former Congressman Dalton Dallagnol, the former prosecutor who got Lula da Silva convicted for corruption, also here, lost his seat by order of Moraes Court. A survey showed that 70% of Brazilian members of Congress believe the Supreme Court invades their powers. Some of 2/3 of Brazilians believe the country lives under a judicial dictatorship. Demonstrations with hundreds of thousands of people are mostly against Moraes. The Brazilian people and Congress know Moraes is out of control, but are paralyzed with fear. Many ask how one justice can do all these things, given that Brazil has laws defending freedom of expression. In fact, Alexandre Moraes does not have this power by law, and his actions flagrantly violate the Brazilian Constitution, specifically Article 5, items 4, 9, and Article 220, as well as international laws, which Brazil is a signatory, such as Article 13, paragraph 1 and 2, and the American Convention of Human Rights, and Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These censorship and persecution actions occur within illegal process, such as the mentioned fake news probe, which is now investigating even Elon Musk, where Moraes acts as the alleged victim, investigator, prosecutor, and judge without the right to appeal. He also acts through his seat in TSC, which granted itself exceptional powers during the 2022 elections that persist to these days. These acts occurred in a veiled way, with cases running under legal secrecy and lawyers not having full access to the case files. My case is iconic in that sense. For about 1.5 years, I have been suffering the described penalties without being formally notified or informed of any decisions or procedures against me, making me unable to defend myself. I only access the decisions against me when the Judiciary Committee of this House subpoenaed acts requesting and publicizing Moraes' decision. The content, which generally lacks legal basis and specifics on violated laws, shocked me, the world, and the Brazilian people. This secrecy occurs because Brazil has no law criminalizing fake news, whatever that is. For these reasons, Moraes currently faces 100 complaints in the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. Regrettably, they have been sitting on these cases. The United States may have a broad role in this sad story as well. Some could even say that the US government and NGOs acted directly in strengthening Brazil's censorship apparatus. First, the US government may have assisted the Brazilian TSC in developing strategies to quote-unquote combat disinformation and strengthen censorship practice, with FBI agents and US Department of Justice officials participating in TSC council meetings, with the participation as well of the Brazilian intelligence agency, ABIN. These meetings mark the beginning of TSC's authoritarian escalation. The tactics outlined in the recent Censorship Industrial Complex report by this House Committee on the Judiciary, which details how the Biden administration coerced big tech companies to censor Americans, closely resemble the modus operandi in Brazil. However, while the Biden administration acted mostly informally, Moraes issued judicial orders throughout Brazil's highest court, threatening fines or complete disconnection from Brazil if big tech challenged them, as happened to Telegram in March 2022. American NGOs, including George Soros' Open Society and the Ford Foundation and the Woke Foundation, funded initiatives that worked closely with Moraes. The Atlantic Council, also funded by Soros, supplied reports and the theoretical foundation crucial to his fake news probe. But perhaps the most frightening influence was a systematic campaign that used all the soft power of American foreign policy as a quote-unquote discreet campaign to defend Brazilian elections, according to a 2023 Financial Times article. This involved covert actions by high-ranking U.S. officials, such as the CIA director, the Secretary of Defense, and Biden's national security advisor, who threatened public officials, military leaders, and Brazilian politicians with sanctions to ensure Moraes was not challenged. It's puzzling why the U.S., historically a promoter of freedom and democracy, would use its top officials to support censorship and aid in the ascent of a president aligned with China, Russia, Hamas, Cuba, Venezuela, drug cartels, and opposed to American interests globally, even undermining the dollar as the world's reserve currency. CIA Director William Burns and other Biden administration key agents continue to meet with officials from the Lula da Silva government and TSC in Brazil, focusing on quote-unquote combating disinformation, which we know now is a code word for censorship of unpleasant speech. Additionally, a Brazilian congressional delegation supportive of Lula da Silva regime, including a congresswoman from the Communist Party, visited Washington, D.C. last week to meet with members of the Democratic Party and OAS representatives. Mr. Chairman, you are well aware of the immense challenges you had to overcome in order for this hearing to happen. Why? In Brazil, ultimately, it will be up to the Brazilian people to solve their own problems. But it's important that the United States of America once again become a force for freedom and no longer for censorship. The United States Congress has enormous powers in this direction, and I urge you to use them. First, ensure that Moraes Lula regime stops operating in the shadow. As the Bible says in John 8:32, then you'll know the truth, and truth shall set you free. Brazil needs to be the subject of more frequent hearings, and Congress must continue to use its powers to bring light to the facts. Congressmen, visit Brazil. I speak on behalf of the Brazilian congressmen here that you are welcome in our parliament, and your presence will bring greater visibility to what has been happening. Second, exercise oversight power against executive branch policies that harm not only freedoms in Brazil, but also U.S. global interests, pushing my country towards nations hostile to America, such as China. Third, withhold funds and resources, not only those destined for Brazil, but also for international organizations, such as the OAS, that are shirking their roles. The American taxpayer should not finance the oppression of my people. Finally, produce legislation imposing harsh sanctions on Brazilian government and officials who violate fundamental rights and freedoms. With this help, I guarantee that my country's institution will react and return our freedoms. This is what I beg of you on behalf of millions of Brazilians. God bless America, God bless Brazil.
Se inscreve no canal, curta, comente, compartilha. Até o próximo vídeo.